So for a lot of intermediate athletes, folks get to a decent level, right? Of able to do some stuff, can do gymnastics movements, can do some of them in workouts, maybe have a few things that they struggle with, can lift some weights at an RX level, maybe get a little bit tired and have a hard time hitting numbers that they can normally hit. So there's this sort of avatar of an athlete that's like, I can do most stuff. I can kind of do it okay. I struggle to do it at the level that I would like to for competition purposes. And something that we sort of see anecdotally from people who reach that level is that they typically get there in two almost pretty disparate ways, right? One of those ways is they just sort of show up to the gym, they follow a blog program, they follow maybe their class program and like do a bunch of extra stuff. And they just kind of like do a lot of anything and everything, right? And just do a lot of CrossFit, and they're relatively adaptable and resilient, and they get like kind of good at it. And so they're like, cool, all I really did to get here was just a bunch of CrossFit, and to continue to get better, what do I need to do? More CrossFit, right? And so that can be a potential problem for those folks, since they're just sort of like throwing stuff at the wall and without really having a plan and hoping to improve. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who can get to an intermediate level by doing a lot of very structured training, right? Lots of intervals, like 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, lots of rear foot elevated split squats, lots of isometric holds, single leg wall sits, FLR on rings, right? And they're like, I'm building my structure. I'm setting a long-term plan. I don't want to bite off more than I can chew. I'm trying to progress through this. And for those people, right, they can get to a level that's like pretty good, but they just fall apart in workouts all the time, similar to the athlete that we were talking about previously, right? Maybe they can do muscle ups, but they're like, oh yeah, I chicken wing, my shoulder extension isn't where it needs to be. I need to do a 6-month progression of like banded whatevers to improve that. And for those people, right, that's also not necessarily going to be the best path forward. So we just wanted to talk about what should intermediate athletes be focusing on? How much of their sport should they be doing versus how much like general strength and conditioning training, and sort of talk about it through the lens of, right, someone who like got to an intermediate level without really having a plan and just sort of going for it versus someone who got to an intermediate level by having like a very specific plan, potentially working with a coach who's like, okay, like we're tracking how many squats you're doing this week and we need to make sure that, we're progressing that volume over time and all that. So Luke, what do you think? What should these people be thinking about?
Well, I think that what sort of when you get to that stage and you're looking to progress and things start to slow down, you obviously need to start doing the thing that you haven't done previously. And I think that it's more common now to find people going through their training early on, developing structure early on, and then having to sort of move away from that and practice their sport more. And sometimes that can be quite difficult to get across to people, because for the individual who just does sort of random stuff and CrossFit, and they tend to sort of self-organize and develop over time, and then getting them to have a bit more of an appreciation for structure is a bit easier than the other way around. Getting people to have a little bit more of an appreciation for, say, the sport and doing things that are a bit more random, a little bit more chaotic. Sometimes that can be a real hard sell if someone has developed a lot of sort of good training history off of structured intervals, strength training, and doing some stuff that looks a little bit more like traditional strength and conditioning. But it is something that I think a lot of people they just need to be able to look at it objectively. And this is obviously where having like a coach helps, because that person is able to make the decision for you and sort of guide you through the process. But I find that it can be quite difficult for people to sort of make that switch. People tend to be quite attached to doing the things that have made them sort of get to the stage where they're at. But you have to sort of understand that when you get to, say for example, you had great success following, a certain strength progression or whatever it is, you can't really run through that again, because you're a different athlete to who you were when you started it. So a lot of people don't necessarily think that, and they're sort of just under this impression that you can do small of once and then take a month off, twice, take a month off. Maybe not that serious, but there's sort of almost this, I can just rinse and repeat, doing what I've done previously, but I'm of a greater capacity now, so I'm able to put in greater efforts, and the same sort of rate of adaptation is going to occur. And then I think that, we were talking just before we started recording about the difficulty to separate what is strength and conditioning and what is practicing the sport. In a gym-based sport, there's a lot more, you could say, dogmatic thinking around things. When I speak to general population clients who are just looking to sort of train for health, or if I'm looking or speaking with more sports performance clients, when I tell them, okay, we're going to do this because of this reason, and say, for example, they ask, okay, well, why don't we do this? And I'll explain why. Usually that's just a lot easier of a conversation. Whereas with individuals who are involved in, say, weightlifting or CrossFit or a gym-based sport, when I've had those conversations, it's like, but I must do this, but I must do that. Or there's a little bit more thinking behind it, which, they feel attached to certain things because they've actually provided them success. But as we know with CrossFit, it's ever changing, and I think a lot more of the time you just need to be thinking about how can you actually create stimulus, more so than actually going through specific training modalities. And creating stimulus for each individual is going to be very, very different.
Yeah, I think that the way that might be useful to think about it is, let's just say we have a distribution of training, right? We have 100% of our training, and some percentage of that needs to be focused on doing actual like sport practice, right? Some percentage of that needs to be focused on doing like strength and conditioning to make us better, and more resilient, so as to be able to handle our sport. And then some percentage of that training also needs to be devoted to almost like, not, I already used the word practice, right? But like drills for the sport, right? So like not scrimmaging, not playing games, but doing drills that are focused on improving specific aspects that are potentially lagging behind or that need more focused attention, right? And so that all has to add up to 100% in some capacity. And the actual allocation that's appropriate for every athlete is going to be slightly different, right? Some people need, 90% of their training to just be like scrimmaging, playing games, whatever, right? And that's what we see from a lot of high level CrossFit Games athletes, that a lot of their training is essentially just like scrimmaging all the time, and some people, at the intermediate level may need to have their training look like that, because all they did to get to that point is like they built a really solid foundation of FLRs and Turkish get-ups. And it's like, yeah, you just got to do thrusters and pull-ups now. Like, and on the other end of the spectrum, we have people who get to that intermediate level by just kind of getting after it every single day. And they've never taken the time to be like, let's learn how to pace. Let's do some rowing intervals. Like, let's escalate pace on each of these 5 sets of kettlebell swings and burpees so that those different gears of your engine. And so for that individual, a larger percentage of their training distribution needs to be focused on like doing drills, right? Like figuring out skills, figuring out pacing. And so there's not necessarily a right answer, but often, like you mentioned, Luke, you'll see people who they've done almost all one thing. And so there's low-hanging fruit in one of those other areas. So allocating some of their training distribution to those areas is going to be helpful for them.
How do you also see the kind of social influence on these people? Because, we talked there about people who they've done things before, it worked for them, they want to do it again, they think that's the way to get better. But I often see a lot of people who are saying, oh, I saw such and such a person do this program and, they PR'd their mile time or whatever it is. And it's like, okay, that, we don't need to just jump on what they're doing just because it worked for that person. Whether, it might be something that works for you, it might not, but just because it worked for them, don't assume that we can automatically pump it into your program.
Yeah, I think that that's a common issue in anything, right? Is that humans are incredible mimics, right? We're very plugged in, like you mentioned, to the sort of like social paradigm of what's happening, not even necessarily just social media, but people in the gym, people in the broader community. Like people know what's going on and like who's doing well and who's having success, right? And across all areas, whether it's a sport, whether it's work, whether it's school, learning a skill, whatever, people basically just look to someone who is doing well and just copy what they're doing, right? Just blindly copy it, which is actually a pretty good strategy for getting better at stuff, right? Like, oh, what are they doing? That seems to be going well. I'll just do that exact same thing. And there's obviously a downside to that because there's times when that isn't appropriate. And especially in something like, a messy, chaotic sport like CrossFit where there's so much happening, people can be very easily led astray. Like you mentioned, Jon, it's like, oh, like they did this mile program, I need to do this mile program, right? Thinking that it's just like this modular thing that can be taken and like extracted and put over into your thing. And it's just going to work the exact same way. It's like, well, the input is training this mile program and the output is a PR. Like I just take it and I put it over here and that's what I do. But obviously it's just not that simple. Otherwise everyone would just be setting PRs on everything all the time because you would just do the thing that the most prestigious person did and achieved your goal. Simple as that.
The key with all those things is that sort of it's like a lot of it is adherence, and I just always find that when I'm having those conversations with individuals, and it's just like it's usually the same individuals, and it's just I'm constantly like, you need to just find what it is that it's that you're gonna do consistently, and buy into, and I tell you what, there has been actually some occasions where I've actually included more of the thing that the individual wants in their training because it sort of just gets them to actually like go with it, and then does that thing work? Maybe not. I can't say 100%. But what does work is them being bought into what they're doing and them doing it, and I think that there's a level of like give and take that you have to do in coaching. I definitely like let go of a lot of things now compared to a few years ago. I've been like hell bent and being like, no, this is the way, you follow it or you don't. But I do think that when we do see things on social media and when we do see things that are like have worked for other people, we're usually looking at people who have put in a lot of time and have adhered to that thing, or we're looking at people who tend to just do well and adapt to anything. And I know with the athletes I've seen the most success with, that I've worked with, there's a tendency that their focus is actually on just like the day to day, and actually just like performing and maximizing what they can do, not necessarily too much on the plan. Obviously they're concerned with the plan because that's what is going to help them, but it's more of an attitude towards developing solid training habits, being consistent, turning up every day, just doing the thing, being bought into the whole thing. And that is what ends up working. It's like the real cliche of this, the program that doesn't, it's like the worst program adhered to 100% is better than the best program adhered to whatever, 80%. But it's real. And I think that a lot of the time when people have those social pressures, it's just like, yeah, just do the thing. Yeah.
I think it's something we see a lot in CrossFit, just based on the top name athletes, the What is Rich Doing program, Matt Fraser's program. People assume that it's going to work for them because it's worked for the best athletes. And it's not that those programs can't help someone improve, because they definitely can. Same as what you're saying there, Luke, if you're sticking to the program 100%, even if it's not an ideal program for you, you're going to make progress. But it's, that's the same in any area of life. People who bought the Tom Brady book on, what is it, TB12 program or whatever it's called.
Yeah. And you got to get those suppies too. Got to get those TB12 suppies.
You're getting a certain amount of alkaline water every day to, the reality is, no, he's someone who worked very hard and is clearly genetically gifted for what he does, to be at the level he's at, and he's 40, 41.
Something. Yeah.
Yeah.
40 something.
And I don't know how many books he sold on how much he makes on his supplements and all this kind of stuff, but you can guarantee there's some, 50-year-old overweight guy who played football in high school 30 years ago and thinks that following this program is going to get him back in shape. And it's like, well, it's going to be better than nothing. But the reality is you need to do something that's more appropriate for you. And what Tom Brady does is not what you need.
Yeah, and I think that related to that, kind of like what Luke was saying, right? I mean, adherence is really important. And this ties into something I was just going to ask you guys, which is, okay, how do you figure out what someone should be doing, right? How much should they practice their sport? How much should they do, pacing intervals? How much should they do farmers walks and like dumbbell step ups, And for me, the way that I tend to find that stuff, sort of like we mentioned before, okay, yeah, like let's look at the distribution of what you've done and let's see if there's any low hanging fruit that we can pick that you haven't done in the past, where we might have just like super easy opportunities to make progress. But I do think that trial and error and iteration over time is the way to figure that out, right? It's like, okay, like let's try using this program. Let's see if it works. Let's try using this much, like high intensity interval training. Let's see if that works. Let's have you do like a nasty CrossFit-ish Metcon 3 days a week. Let's see if that works. And if you can adhere to something for a block of time, even if it's not the right thing, that then enables you to make these kind of iterative trial and error adjustments, right? It doesn't help if you're like, oh yeah, I didn't actually do what I was supposed to for 3 weeks. So like, who knows if it worked or not? Hard to say because you just didn't actually do it. But if you did it and we see results, like, okay, something is working, might stop working, but like we have a knob that we can start to turn a little bit. So I don't know. I guess that's how I think about that stuff. And I'm curious what you guys do.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, there's an element to it where it's like, if you're having an inconsistent training week where you miss, around 50% of your training or whatever, and you just you fall off the wagon with nutrition and super high stress with work and all this type of thing. Like if you're having that every, say, 3 to 4 weeks or something like along those lines, it's really hard to be able to be like, okay, this is what works. You can pull from the feedback and just sort of figure out, okay, what's the what are some of the things that have made a positive impact on your performance, just sort of straight off the bat. But I think for me, priority is actually just trying to find that balance as being like, okay, you can do this and you can do this consistently. And that is, I would say, in the first sort of like month, 6 weeks of working with someone, that's what I try to sort of establish first. And there's obviously certain things that you can pick up from people's training results. And you can be like, okay, well, this just seems like something that would be a good direction to go in right now. Let's do it. Because I think the key is it's like, if you're looking to compete at a high level in the sport, it's like you need to be in the gym 5 days a week, training hard, doing sport, let's say 3 to 4 times a week, right? Like there's certain things that you need to be ticking off, and, what you do and how you do it, until you're at that stage, it doesn't really matter, a load, as long as you're hitting movements, all the movements sort of involved in the sport over a 2 to 3 week period. You're challenging yourself in a way which you need to. I suppose I'm a little bit less. I'm a little bit more concerned now with people being able to develop that rather than being able to go through, the super specific prescriptive progression that's going to increase their max output on an assault bike 10-second sprint by X amount. It's like that is like, does that help? If someone is really, really, really not powerful, yeah, it could be something good to have in their program, throughout the year, just sort of until before they start prepping for a competition. But what they actually do and the sort of very specific progressions, like week to week, like that type of stuff doesn't sort of matter too much. What matters is on the macros that they're sort of going through that and they're doing that quite often. But I would say that I have moved a little bit more away from this idea of like, let's test and see where you're at, and then all this other thing, like just based off of conversations at the start of the process, you can usually pick up on, okay, where people need to be and what they need to do. But then again, it is important to make sure that like that is also something that it is for them, because I know there is a lot of thought out there where it's like you need to earn the prescription or the individualization, and you need to be able to show that you bought into the process. And there is a part of me where it's like, yeah, you need to be able to follow something, but it doesn't mean that you need to just do this like copy and paste for 4-week jobby before you get started up. Like you do need to be working on the things. And I think more than anything, the important thing is not necessarily the working on things, but just communicating the things that people are not necessarily good at. Because I think that's what a lot of people want, is they tend to want actually just like clarity on what they need to work on. Obviously, when people are trying to get skills and things like that, it's right in front of their face. They know what they need to work on. But when someone when someone has all those skills, is able to RX everything in the open, is able to sort of, perform pretty well, is probably, one of the best athletes, if not the best athlete in their gym. Sometimes it can be quite difficult for them to understand what they need to work on. And usually just having like those initial conversations, observing, 3 weeks, 4 weeks of training, you're able to pick up on stuff, and just communicating it over to them just changes their perspective and their intention in training, which I think is a huge part. It's not necessarily like, okay, you need to do these EMOMs for this to get fixed, if that makes sense.
And one thing you just said there, Luke, about how someone can be the fittest in their gym, I think that's a really interesting case for when people want to go off program or do something slightly different. Because for the best athlete in the gym, regardless of their level, there's an kind of air of superiority or confidence that on a competition level is maybe not warranted. And I think within kind of someone's smaller ecosystem, it can lead to different things. So they could be an intermediate athlete, but being the best in their gym gives them the attitude of someone who thinks they can kind of do what they like because they're the best. You could put that same level athlete in a higher level gym, and they're maybe going to be more receptive to ways to improve and ways to increase their performance level, because they don't have the same ego. They've kind of already been taken down to the level they're actually at by people in their gym who beat them every day on workouts. And I think that environment is often quite important to make sure that someone's able to do what they need to do and not get kind of distracted by all these different side options.
Yeah, John, to that point, I think that it's just like most stuff, right? There's a spectrum, because the opposite can also happen, where someone is a good athlete where they are, and then they go somewhere where everyone's a lot better, and they're like, I'm fucking terrible and I will never get better, and they lose all their confidence and completely fall apart, right? So it's like there's hubris where you're like, oh, I'm the best, like I know what I'm doing or whatever, right? And it's like, yeah, some of those people need to go to a competition where they get hit in the mouth and they're like, oh wow, like people are a lot better at this than I am, right? And that can help recalibrate them. But on the flip side of that, if someone is just like, these people are so far ahead of me and there's absolutely no way that I can ever catch them, right? That's not a good headspace to be in either for improvement.
I find that that's actually like a really common thing with people who are just sort of getting into the sport, or a lot of times people sort of go through different evolutions of their time in the sport, and maybe they've just had some real focused training for say 4 to 6 months, and they haven't done any qualifiers. And I think this sort of definitely happened with lack of competitions over the last like 18 months or so, right? But I always find that because the sport is growing a lot, and because people are just coming out of nowhere in the sport, especially, it just sort of almost seems that the level just gets pushed up further and further, every 6 months to 12 months. And people are just like, oh shit, like I'm not as good as I thought I was. And there's almost this, like you said, Todd, people can get a bit frustrated because they may have just put in like 4 to 6 months of hard graft and real focused training and been doing everything that they thought they needed to do, and then they don't necessarily end up getting to where they want to because the sport is just it's grown so much. And I think that's something that it can be, I think, when people compete a little bit more, and when they do have say a training environment. And this is a reason why I think you see a lot of the top athletes coming out of gyms where a lot of other top athletes go to now, right? People are trying to create that experience where they get beat, or they're just put in those competitive scenarios. And I think that's something that it is important for people to do, and to sort of try and find within their setup. I mean, I definitely know that when I was training, there was, long periods where I wouldn't compete, and I always found that I would do qualifiers or do the open, and I was like, oh shit. But so one thing I try to do with my athletes is like any, within reason, making sure they're not like just doing, competition after competition after competition, but within reason, letting them compete as much, letting them train with other people as much as they want to, go off program to do that type of stuff. I think is very important to do that.
Yeah, there's a sweet spot with that too, right? And it's like that's going to be individualized for the athlete. Like how much do you need to be taken down a notch and made aware of where you sit versus how much do you need to have your confidence built and feel like you're progressing and actually having a chance at achieving your goals. And again, there's no answer, right? It's just like, okay, those are the two variables that you're playing with, and you have to figure out the right spot.